Hello and welcome to week 3. This week we are going to look at some of the models that we can use to make sure our change is effective. To accomplish this, we're going to begin our time together looking at models that help us understand the whole organization, provide us with a big picture. We're also going to look at a tool called appreciative inquiry, and you're going to have a chance to practice this as you work with your teams. We're going to look at a series of models that help us understand all of the components of an organization. Each model is going to teach us something different. The reason we use these models is to understand the dynamics within an organization, to plan our change project appropriately, to also understand which levers are going to be most important as we start to implement the change project, and also to better plan for unintended consequences. The first model we're going to look at is called the strategic business model. It provides us a series of questions that help us understand the organization overall and the choices this organization is going to make. So starting out at the beginning, the market segments and customer needs. The real question is, who are our customers? What are our markets that we're serving? From there, we're going to try to understand what the value proposition is of the markets. In other words, how do we provide value? How do we differentiate our services or our products? The larger circle that you see in the middle of this slide reflects all the different components of the organization: direction setting, the people, the processes, and the tools, and then the structure of the organization. And then you see in the external part the marketplace. Those are the external influences of it. Here, what we're trying to understand is all of the different ways these things work together. In what ways is the external factors going to impact the organization? How will it affect our talent or our people? What processes and tools will we need as we start to implement our change, and what might work against us? Have we been clear about the direction setting of the organization, and will our change make a difference in terms of that direction setting? So as you look at this bigger circle, you're going to be able to identify all the different pieces and start to think about, how does that impact my change? Or as a diagnostic, what are things that are going on that maybe need to change? The final piece is the values, profitability, or services. In other words, what's the result of all of this work? What are the business results, the financial results? What returns can you expect for your effort? And is this going to lead to a competitive advantage? And that question's built in here. The next two models are similar in that they give us a big picture of the organization. The first one that we're going to look at is the McKinsey 7S model. So you notice that what we've done is taken the organization and broken it into 7 different areas: structure, systems, style, staff, skills, strategy, and of course the overall goals. When we look at this model, again, remember, we're trying to understand the dynamics that are happening. And so that's why you see the lines between them. I don't tend to think of the lines as something that's definitive. I think of them as reflecting that there's an interdependency between them. So it is not to say, if there's not a line drawn between those two things, that there couldn't be a line there. Very often there is. It's showing that each one of these systems interact with each other. So how do I use this? Well, the first thing I'm trying to understand is what's going on. What are some of the things that are working well within the organization? How is structure impacting systems? How are systems impacting the various style or culture of the organization? What is that doing in terms of the kind of staff that we need to hire? And are we hiring the right folks? I might also look at this in a different way. I might understand, when I'm looking at the change, what are the areas that those changes are going to impact the most? So will this change that I'm putting in place, for example, impact the staff? And think about what kinds of new talents or skills that we might need. It'll give me a sense of unintended consequences. If, for example, a system is particularly reliant on something that I'm going to be tweaking with, then it helps me understand what I need to do differently and how I need to prepare that system. So this gives us the major components of the organization, kind of a big picture, and it's both for diagnostic and for planning. This model is really telling us the same type of information that the McKenzie 7S model did. However, it's looking at the slice a little bit differently. Here we're looking at what are the vision, values, strategy, the goals of the organization, and how do they drive our overall direction, the organization's structure, the people and the talent and skills they need, and then the processing tools. As I'm describing this, you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, this sounds pretty familiar. This is what we talked about with the 7S model for McKenzie. It takes a slightly different bent, though, because it now looks at people. And remember I said it looked at the talent as well as the skills that they folks need? In this model, it pulls out culture along with people. Where in McKenzie, of course, you notice that style picked up culture. For direction setting, it picks up leadership and strategic processes, but of course, leadership could also be with people. So it's just a different slice of the same kind of picture, trying to describe all of the different interdependent major components of an organization. For this one, it helps me start to think about, again, how is this change going to take place? What are some things that are working well? What could we need to change? What are the ways that I'm going to use these various components as levers for the change process? In other words, am I going to need to make sure, as we talked about in week 1, that I have the right leadership in place for the change process? Do I need to think about the way that we're going to integrate into processes and tools? And how do I do that? How am I going to work with the folks in terms of building their competencies? What's going to be impacted by my change from the culture? So all those same questions that we had and helped us answer under McKenzie 7S is also available in the organizational design wheel. You're just going to pick whichever tool feels best for the intervention that you're trying to put together. We use the next model slightly differently. In this situation, we're trying to understand what are the drivers of the change? What are the positive conditions that are going to enhance our change? What are some negative conditions that are going to create problems for our change? And then with each one of those, are those conditions internal or external? So this is just trying to help us understand how this change is going to roll through the organization. The last model I'm going to show you may look familiar. It is based in part on the blueprint work that we've done and that you created as part of your change worksheet plan. So notice what we're asking. What is the current state? What's the desired future state? What's different here is as you look across the top, you're going to see that we're looking at the current state in terms of business results, the current state in terms of specific outputs, and finally the current state in terms of individual performance. Similarly with the future state. And then the question becomes, if this is our current state and this is our future state for these 3 elements, what needs to change? What needs to happen to move us from that current state to the future state? So it's a different way of showing the blueprint, trying to understand what are some of the gaps. Now, we happen to pick business results, specific outputs, and individual performance. But of course, you could pick anything that was appropriate to your change project. What are some of the things that are going to make a difference for your change? Identify those both in terms of the current and future state and what the gap is. As I'm describing this, again, this should sound pretty familiar. That's what we worked on during week 2. So how do we use all of these? What I'm going to ask you to do is to select one of the models that we have just discussed, and on your own, for the purposes of your change project, see if you can map out what your organization looks like. What are the elements? And you can change them as you need to. If the model of the McKenzie 7S doesn't quite work for you, tweak it so that you're capturing the specific components for your particular organization. Hopefully, as you start to draw and map this out, you'll be able to understand better how this change is going to roll out across the organization. It may help you think about some folks you hadn't initially thought about that you need to connect with, or it may help you think about some actions that you need to take. So select one of the models that you think makes the most sense to you. See if you can draw out your particular organization and look for some learnings from it. You might find it's helpful to work with someone or your whole learning circle that can help you think through how you would use this. The next tool we're going to be using in our focus for this week is something called appreciative inquiry. By now, hopefully you've had a chance to review the 2 videos that we incorporated into the class materials. If not, this is a good time to stop and then go back to where we're at right now in this video once you've had a chance to review those. I'm going to be reviewing appreciative inquiry at a high level, anticipating that you will have already reviewed those videos. Appreciative inquiry is a tool set that helps us think about the way we engage with the organization or we engage with an individual. It was based on David Copperwriter's idea of how we ask questions can often predetermine the outcome. So instead of going in and talking about what's not working, what if philosophically we change that? What if instead we went in and asked about what's working well? Ultimately, appreciative inquiry has been absorbed into not only the change management structure, but also into organizational development and many other types of processes that we use as we start to work with individuals or an organization. In the video you watched earlier, they talked about the 5D model. The most common model that we use here in North America tends to be the 4D model. Of course, the piece we're missing out is the define. In other words, clarifying the direction, trying to understand what we want to get more of. It's really, in a way, talking about our future state. So you could add as the first phase to make this a 5D model the concept of define. What's the current state? The next element in the appreciative inquiry phases is discover. And that's really where we start to put things in a different philosophy than what we would normally do. So normally we would go in and try to understand, well, what's not working here? But discover says what we want to do is understand what we want more of. We think that's already here. We think it's already in the system. So how do we find out about it? And one of the best ways is by asking powerful questions. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. Once we better understand what's in the system already, we've discovered it, the next step is to really dream. In other words, think about how could we use these best practices that we just identified through our questions in a new way? How can we incorporate it perhaps across the entire organization? Or how can we make sure that everyone is using it as a process? The dream piece is really our planning piece. What does the future look like? And then once we understand what that future looks like, the next piece is the design piece. And that really has to do with not only the plan, but I think of it as what are the levers I need to change? What are the things that are going to make the biggest difference? So I can go in and change a lot of stuff in an organization. And as we saw, it can create a lot of resistance. What if instead I was more planful and I thought about these are the right levers I want to start with. These are the things that are going to make a difference. We're going to show progress right away. And that's going to help us build momentum for the change. And finally, either delivery or destiny is another way to think about it, is now going in and actually doing it, the implementation phase. One of the key skills of appreciative inquiry is our ability to ask questions. In the discovery phase, we want to make sure that our questions are open-ended versus closed-ended. Ultimately, we're going to create what we call powerful questions, but those powerful questions really map to what you see on this slide. They require thoughtful answers, clarify deeper understanding and awareness. They're really designed to help understand what's going on and in a way that is very positive. In other words, what's working here, and we want to make sure that we can replicate. As we noted, the term that we're using is asking powerful questions, and those powerful questions are designed to be thought-provoking, inviting reflection, trying to understand what's working well in the organization. As part of that, we need to be aware of the underlying assumptions that are often part of our questioning. So work at seeing if there's a different way you can ask a question in a way that may not reflect assumptions. So you'll see some examples in the discussion guide that you have this week for your learning circle teams. All the questions should really stimulate curiosity and creativity. And I think the only risk we get into is that we end up in a situation where we're out of scope. And so be aware as you're asking these questions, you still want to make sure that the answers you're getting are. There are three important elements in a powerful question: how we construct it so that it's very open-ended, that it's seeking that thought-provoking answer that we were hoping for. The scope, we talked about that just a minute ago, making sure that it's the right scope, and then identifying assumptions. One of the mindsets I use when I'm starting to think about what questions should I ask that would be a powerful or an appreciative inquiry question is the difference between advocating versus inquiry. So when I'm advocating for myself or I'm advocating for my team, I'm trying to make sure that I convince someone of something else. And so as they're talking, in a way, I'm only half listening, because what I'm really doing is thinking about what my next question would be and how do I convince them. We're going to use that tool, of course, when we move into the influencing. But here we're really trying to think about using our inquiry skills, using words to understand and to learn about the situation. So as a result, we have to be careful as we're starting to think about the questions, the ways that we can ask it. And this next chart shows some good examples. So the least powerful question, of course, are yes or no questions. Do we do this? Yes or no. Versus the kinds of questions that gain more information. How do you typically approach a problem like this? Why would you take these steps? What if we were to try this approach? What would the difference be in terms of the results? Notice how the kinds of questions I'm asking have really shifted the answers, and it moves us from a less defensive approach, from an advocacy approach, to really trying to understand what's possible. And remember, what we're trying to do is get best examples. So we want to be careful. Sometimes when you ask why, it can seem like we're being inquisitive in a way that's almost negative in its connotation. So why should be more of a reflective question as opposed to, well, why did you do that? Which does not give you that open-ended question. It doesn't give you a response or a feeling or an environment of positivity and trying to figure out what are our best practices. So the way you have to ask why is a little bit different because people can be naturally defensive about that question. One of the biggest challenges we have when we're looking at appreciative inquiry is our scope. It can be so fascinating to hear someone describe what is possible and what kinds of things are working so well. And so you can really expand and all of a sudden find that you're way beyond the scope that's appropriate for your particular group. So be a little careful with scope. As you see in the examples on this particular slide, you can ask the question, how can we best share this information as a team? And that can ultimately be expanded in terms of scope, in terms of communities or even coalitions. We want to make sure whatever questions we're asking, the scope is the right scope for your change project. All our questions, of course, are going to have some degree of assumptions built into it. And one of our jobs as we start to design the questions is to identify what are some of the assumptions. And a good way to do this is by working with a partner. I included an example in the discussion guide that I provided for the learning circles that I think really illustrates how assumptions can take place. So if you look at the last page of the discussion guide, you'll see in the exercise an example of two questions, and the question is, what assumptions are built into it? Let's look at the first one. The first question is, how can we create a bilingual education system in Kansas? Versus, what if we changed the question and we said, what's the best way to educate English and non-English speaking individuals? What's the difference? What assumptions did we build in to the first question that are not part of the second question? So once you've designed your questions, what I'd like you to do is to think about what's the scope that you've included and what are some of the assumptions associated with it. I'm going to ask you in your Learning Circle meetings this week to practice using appreciative inquiry in two different ways. For the first process, what I'd like you to do is, as you give updates to your project, I'd like the learning team members to ask you questions that match the appreciative inquiry model that we've been discussing. So in the discovery phase, asking open-ended questions, making sure the scope is correct, that it doesn't build in any assumptions. So ask each other questions that practice using the appreciative inquiry. Second of all, I'd like you to use appreciative inquiry for your work in your projects this week. And in order to do that, it helps to design the questions up front. So work with each other. What kinds of questions could you ask, and who should you ask these questions to that would really enhance your learning in your change project? We'll go ahead and create the questions week 3, and then week 4 is when you'll actually implement them so that you have plenty of time to not only complete the questions that you need and the work you need to do in your change project, but also to complete your research project. So that gives you a little insight in terms of how we often approach a change project. First, as we went through the various models that helped us look at the interdependencies, a picture, if you will, of our organizations and what we can learn from that. And second, this tool of appreciative inquiry, which has to do with making sure that we're asking questions in a way that really promotes discovery, that helps us think about what's happening and going well in our organizations and how can we apply that. I look forward to reading more about your change projects and the progress you're making.